everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of our ongoing editorial webinar series, Coffee Talk. Each hour-long information-packed episode features observations and insights of an independent expert on a wide range of tech industry topics. Many thanks to the underwriting sponsor of this episode, Red Canary, a pioneer of managed detection and response to secure your endpoints, cloud, and whatever comes next. Without their support, this series would not be possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I will be your moderator. Today, you are joining us for our Threat Alert Monthly Top Attack Overview, and our main presenter is that lovely fellow you can see on your screen right now, Ian Thornton Trump. But before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. This episode is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way in the next few days. We'll make some time during the talk for questions. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. On the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see some extra resources provided by our sponsor. Be sure to check those out. And as a small thank you to the first 200 attendees who stick with us to the end, we will be sending you a $5 gift certificate to Starbucks. It's a cup of joe to go with the info. Now let's meet our first presenter. Ian Thornton Trump, Chief Information Security Officer at UK-based threat intelligence service provider CyberCryminal, is an ITIL certified professional with 25 years of experience in IT security. His career has spanned the military intelligence branch of the Canadian Armed Forces, the Canadian Forces Military Police Reserves, and the RCMP, yep, that's the Mounties, where he served as a criminal intelligence analyst. He has worked as a cybersecurity consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare organizations. His research and experience have made him a sought-after expert on cyber threat intelligence programs for enterprises both large and small, not to mention us. He's one of our favorite presenters. You are in for a great one. Take it away, Ian.
Well, John, thank you very much for that amazing introduction. You know, these are the exciting ones, and especially this time of year with February and March. This is a time frame where we sort of look retrospectively back at cybersecurity, like what happened in 2022, what we think might be going on in 2023. I'm taking a very high-level look at this and kind of pointing out some of my favorite stories and favorite reports that have dropped this month. I tried to confine it to March, but so much of what I'm going to talk about really has deep roots into the cybersecurity criminal underground that keeps advancing the ball. And we've had some really interesting research reports and ideas happen, of course, with the background of the Ukrainian conflict. So I hope you guys are as excited about this presentation that I am to give, because all I'm going to say is we are seeing a cybercrime eruption. Now, I put a question mark there because it has a lot to do with your perspective, either as on the vendor side, like our great friends and partners, Red Canary, doing their best to save businesses with their managed detection and response capabilities. Brian's going to go in depth on that and be quite technical, I think. So I'm really excited to listen to his presentation as well. But for me, working at a higher strategic level, March is always the time frame where we get an idea and get the reports of what has happened last year. But then we try to take a look at it and move forward into this next year with some ideas around what, is it going to get better or worse, right? Who's responsible for the majority of these types of cyber attacks that we're faced with? The big part of threat intelligence that many of you folks in our viewers and our audience will know is trying to answer the so what piece. We can always talk about a number of data breaches. We can always talk about, the big, vast amounts of money that is attributed to the global loss in cyber crimes, et cetera. But the bottom line here is, what does it mean for my business? What does it mean for my in-flight IT projects? And is there a strategic or tactical response required by our businesses? So please enjoy what I'm about to tell you, and at the same time, hunker down, because there is a lot of distraction and misdirection being thrown at us as IT security professionals. The real question, of course, is, are you ready to face these challenges in 2023 and maybe even into 2024? So let's start off with some really interesting data that came out about the longevity, I would say, of some of the cybercrime actors that we're faced with. So this is really interesting to me, folks, because here is a threat actor who has had a very long time on the scene with indictments and activity that date back to 2012. Now, of course, he's back in the news, as it were, and is obviously embroiled in the FBI wanting him, and there's all of his aliases and stuff like that. But interestingly enough, these are some of the key folks that are involved in cybercrime today. And I think what's really important to pull out of this is this recent announcement of the Doppelpaymer group being targeted, a prolific ransomware group, 601 companies worldwide, including 37 organizations in Germany. The head guy, if you were, of Doppelpaymer is this guy, Igor. And Igor goes way, way back to the days of the early types of banking Trojans, specifically Bugat, Citrix, and Dridex, which many other fundamental ransomware crews that are doing everything from key loggers to the actual delivery of malware and remote access Trojans. Another big story about remote access Trojans that we'll get into. But what's really interesting to me about Igor here is he used to roll with Yakubets. And Yakubets is a really interesting guy. He shows up as the co-conspirator or the co-indicted in a indictment that came down from the Western District of Pennsylvania. It's stamped 2019. The investigation goes back to 2014, where the earliest strains of his malware was being used for banking fraud and ACH, automated clearinghouse transfers. Now, what's really interesting is Yakubets is none other than a cyber threat actor we knew as Aqua. And Aqua was at large for a very long time until he was outdone by having his splintered pattern Lamborghini that had, I believe, a license plate called Cybercrime, abbreviated, driving around, okay? So what's interesting to me is some of these old, long-term folks that have been involved in the earliest days of cybercrime are coming into like their 10-year, their 15, in some cases nearly 20-year anniversaries. And so one of the things that we're really seeing is that the investigations, the prosecution, in some cases the extraditions that need to take place are a tremendously long process. So in a sense, a lot of what we talk about that happened last year happened many, many years before last year. And we're now seeing these folks hopefully being brought to justice. So the Doppelpaymer indictment is a fascinating look at the ecosystem of cybercrime. And I think it's really worth your time. If you have access for Pacer or if you want more of this research, I'm super happy to share it if you DM me or reach out to me and contact me at Fat Hobbit. All right, so let's take a look a little bit at what the reality is that we're faced with right now. The reality is, and some of the latest research are showing that we still have a phishing problem in this day and age. Now, we've been dealing with, ever since sort of the first spam started back in, I would say, 2005 era, with email spam, offering everything from Viagra to romance scams that were being spewed out, and the Nigerian 419 scams and all of that stuff. We go all the way back, and we're still seeing phishing being a major problem that we have in cybersecurity. And of course, vulnerability management has been something we've been talking about since probably earlier than 2010. This is another huge area. But what was a little bit surprising from the 2022 engagements that Dell SecureWorks had investigated is the amount of focus of nearly 15% of cyber threat actors resorting to brute force and stolen credentials to gain illicit access, but 9%, so nearly 10% of all the information response engagements were insider threat related. So I tend to believe that insider threat is not necessarily an IT problem. It strikes me that there are deep cultural issues within organizations. But contrast that to the earlier in 2022 arrest of another guy named Igor, this time with an E, who was trying to gain access to Tesla by trying to corrupt a Tesla employee to insert a USB stick into the Tesla network. So these old methods and methodologies of gaining access, illicit access into organizations, have not changed a lot since the earliest days. The difference is these attacks are a lot more sophisticated than they used to. We're talking about multi-stage payloads. We're talking about fileless malware. We're talking about obfuscation at a level that we used to think only nation states were capable of. But the advances in malware are something that is significant. And it really demands now extra vigilance and extra capabilities that the average medium to small business just is overwhelmed with and can barely face it. Now, of course, the big report that always comes out is the IC3 report from the U.S. FBI that compiles all of the data they can get their hands on in terms of what the major threats to, I would say, both cyber and cyber-enabled crime. Now, there's a big caveat to these numbers, because when you are ripped off by something like a business email compromise, right, or an advance free, or a confidence fraud, a romance fraud, these types of frauds are very personal, and people get very angry, and that anger will make them desire to report the activity. Less so than when you're victimized by something like malware in an organization. So keep in mind that IC3 is sort of, I would say, a windage test, if you will, to see where the trends in cybercrime are growing. And if you haven't been asleep, you've seen the massive growth in business email compromise attacks. Now, this is really important because there are both proactive and reactive elements for business email compromise that are sort of a part of the whole threat that you're dealing with in terms of like someone social engineering their way into your organization and conducting illicit activities as a result of getting inside that organization one way or another. And this is why, when you look at the different solutions that are out there in terms of preventing that initial infiltration into your organization so a Beck attack can be conducted, this is why the more intel we have about these threat actors, the more vigilant we are about normal operations on a computer and the implementation of processes, it becomes a clarion call for the organization in terms of, look at that monetary loss that has exploded, with almost an extra $400 million of damages in the 1 year. I think the other thing that's really interesting to see is that the efforts to give information around fraud, specifically targeting elders, and the FBI has a specialized unit that deals with elder fraud. We can see that perhaps education has impacted the landscape a little bit, where that confidence fraud, romance schemes are getting more widely publicized. There was the documentary that came out on Netflix called The Tinder Swindler. So all of these things, I think, have actually helped reduce that type of attack. The problem that we're seeing, especially going back to business email compromise for a moment, is the fact that a lot of data has been stolen by a lot of cyber criminals. That data is available on the dark web and is sold in forums, and it can be weaponized and used against your organization very easily. Because once that data gets out there, it can be recycled and used into a whole bunch of different scams. So that was sort of based on the two big kind of reports that dropped in March. It does set the stage for understanding a little bit and refining threat models a little bit better than we've had moving into the new sort of, I would say, grand scheme of things. And I think when you see the way the U.S. government is reporting on cybercrime losses, you'll see quite quickly that we have an almost instinctive understanding that a lot of these require social engineering skills and additional services from the cybercrime underground to be successful. It was really interesting to me, though, and this is sort of another thing that has come up on the radar, where you see investment sitting at a $3 billion loss, almost doubling from the previous year, actually more than doubling from the previous year. This might be as a result of the various Bitcoin scams and operations that have negatively impacted people as a result of those type of investment opportunities. So something to be aware of, that organizations will be approached, but it's usually individuals that are falling for the old game of get rich quick, right? Now, a couple of other things came out as well that always fascinate me. Big focus on the cybersecurity infrastructure security agencies, KEV. The KEV changed quite a bit. That KEV stands for the known exploited vulnerabilities. I had some thoughts that I put together in this Forbes article back in March around the U.S. security agencies' mandated issue now, 3 weeks to update. And this was as a result of a bunch of 0 days for Microsoft Office that Microsoft finally patched. Now, what's remarkable about this is we used to see best practices were 1 month for critical vulnerabilities. So the U.S. security agency or cybersecurity infrastructure, CISA, all of a sudden changed the game a little bit, basically saying, hey, the new government best practices for non-secure networks is 3 weeks, folks. So we've now carved a week off, realizing that particular tempo of patching and updating is no longer effective against a cybersecurity vulnerability that is under active exploitation. So that was sort of a really interesting thing that people didn't really talk about, but now I'm reading between the lines. And when you think about the amount of interaction that web browsers and the email have directly with the internet, you can see why the attack surface when it comes to Microsoft Office is so high and so important to defend against. Now, this one, some folks might think is a little bit boring in terms of a major topic, but this is a really interesting one. Now, another report that came out, very sort of, it set the stage for this, and you may have seen it in the press in March about how in the United States, the top two attacked organizations are healthcare, as well as manufacturing. So these are the two business verticals, industry verticals, that seem to be under the most attack by cybercriminal and ransomware operators. Okay, so interestingly enough, HSS, the Health and Human Services, or HHS as they're called, in cooperation with something that I didn't even know existed, the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response, they've put out a standard now for best practices and risk management principles for all healthcare organizations in the United States. Now, this is an update to an original document that dates back to 2015. What's interesting about this is everyone sat down and tried to now align this to NIST. And this was sort of, I would say, a fraught with peril a little bit, because it is an 84-page document, if you can believe this, on NIST for healthcare. The problem is it will be completely overwhelming for a tremendous amount of healthcare organizations that are simply, 4 or 5 GPs in a practice in a rural part of the United States. It would be absolutely unbelievably expensive to implement NIST 800, which is essentially what this document is telling you to do, for a small practice. Now, I get that a small practice is potentially as more or as vulnerable as a large practice. I completely understand that. But this is incredibly cumbersome to those small practices and will need an awful lot of heavy lifting to get even close to meeting a NIST 800 standard. So this story here is that everyone recognizes that healthcare attacks, especially because the United States model is a for-profit healthcare, which makes these organizations very tempting for cyber criminals, not to mention the penalties that can be incurred by under HIPAA that basically will penalize an organization for losing control of patient information. Now, later on in this presentation, I've got some really interesting and eye-opening data around that, and we'll discuss that and reference that in a moment. But the biggest news was the destruction of breach forums. So you can see two interesting indictments here. Now, Connor Brian Fitzpatrick, the 20-year-old citizen of the United States who resides in Peekskill, New York, essentially was arrested for having one of the largest ever collection of stolen data, facilitating crazy amounts of cybercrime. And this was a really interesting case where this guy essentially started down his life of cybercrime. The indictment is unbelievable because one of the things, and guys, like, you're just not going to believe this. One of the things that he did is he did basically a public interview using the alias Palm. Okay, now I'm just going to say, clearly not a cybercrime genius of any capacity whatsoever. So first of all, from an operational security perspective, it's about as dumb as the guy that was on the run who got nipped because his girlfriend put a picture of him on social media when they had escaped Ukraine. Okay, so Connor here really got pinched. He had given public interviews. That was a huge operational security failure. But there's interesting subpart of this, because what these two indictments really talk about, the second one, as you're looking at my screen on the right-hand side, is the story of raid forums being taken down by a coordinated effort between the United Kingdom and the United States. So this was a shot across the bow completely to deal with an international threat. So raid forums is where a lot of stolen data was sold, as well as breach forums as well. So during the month of March, two major efforts took place to disrupt the whole cybercrime forum. Now, this is almost effective as pinching off the money that these folks were making, but taking down the gathering place, two gathering places, relatively quickly in short order, essentially led to some pretty startling cross-border work by all the agencies in order to deal with these folks as well. Now, there was another big disruption operation, and you can see again a major effort by global cybercrime to arrest a Croatian national, Mario Zanko, went under the alias Doogie Docs. Now, the neat thing about this is the press never mentioned his name, and it was up to Brian Krebs to unearth who this person was based on domain registration information, where he actually used the email mariozanko@gmail.com. So again, what we're seeing is these folks that have been in cybercrime are making huge operational security mistakes, making it relatively easy for researchers to track them down and find where they dwell and bring that information to the attention of the global anti-cybercrime effort headed up by organizations like Europol, Interpol, and whatnot. Now, the other piece of this was really interesting. Croatia arrested him, and he's going to face the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the Croatian equivalent of that. But the other telling quotation that came out of this, law enforcement in Switzerland on Tuesday seized the computer server hosting the NetWire RAT infrastructure, remote access Trojan. So we had major cybercrime forums pushed off the internet as a result of coordinated effort, and we had a remote access Trojan infrastructure that was also disrupted by international cooperation. This is one of the trends that I think we're going to see quite a bit more of. Now, another thing that we need to talk about is CLOP. CLOP is a Russian-affiliated cybercrime group. Now, they have also been around since 2019, but they have really stormed onto the scene as they've developed. And we're seeing major organizations, including, I believe, it's Procter & Gamble, get hit as a result of this piece of software called Go Anywhere, which is essentially was a secure web file transfer solution, not so secure, but it had a zero-day flaw. And what's really interesting about this is so many folks, are just buying a thing that says secure, when actually a vulnerability scan or things like that, or testing and assuming that it's secure, instead of wrapping mitigative controls around it, like IP address whitelisting. I know it's a hassle, folks, but honest to goodness, what you really need to do is make sure that anything facing the internet is running some sort of EDR, MDR solution, and you have other restrictions in place. Because anything globally available is going to be found by Shodan, and anything that can be found by Shodan that shows an out-of-date and then it's hit by a vulnerability scanner, and Bob's your uncle, in come the bad guys, out goes your data, and you get a nice ransomware note. And it happens that quickly, day in and day out. We saw the weaponization earlier in the year, just I believe it was in January, of the ESXi flaw that was rapidly exploited by threat actors. Now, another big thing came into place in the U.S., and that is the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which is an update to previous national cybersecurity strategies. But this one in particular had some really new wrinkles that they threw into it. The clarion call for the disruption and dismantlement of threat actors, I think we can already say, is now in place and is something that the FBI is taking seriously and seems to have the resources that they can occasionally call into from the intelligence agencies to help them do and be successful on that particular mission. Now, the big one is shaping the market forces to drive security and resilience. This is something that we haven't seen in quite some time, where specific organizations with vulnerabilities are being asked to call them out publicly and advise. This coming on the heels of earlier last year, where unfortunately people didn't get the message. This was almost more than a year ago with the beginnings of the Ukrainian war, to, for goodness sakes, patch your firewalls if it happens to be the WatchGuard firewall, and the FBI had to do basically get permission from a judge in absentia to patch the firewalls on behalf of organizations by essentially breaking in to those networks and patching their WatchGuard firewalls because they didn't. Now, I said that I wanted to get a little bit down into the details of data breach and settlements. This came out, which is a settlement agreement. Now, the organization is going to settle the data breach for $1.75 million. Now, you can see that we now have, and this happened in a federal court, we now have some ordinary losses and extraordinary losses, and if this settlement is approved, this now becomes a potential precedent for all other similar cases where data breach has occurred and people have had their personal data. And this one's a bit more interesting than that because it was generally students that this data breach was applicable to, high school students, so children. So think about that for a moment, children and their parents. Now, there was a number of caveats built into this particular thing, and I've highlighted them there, that you somehow have to prove that this data was never stolen before, and that you have suffered actual loss as a result of it that is traceable. The information used is traceable back to this particular data breach. They are also a caveat saying reasonable efforts to avoid or seek reimbursement for the loss. So you do have to sort of say, well, okay, I know that this website that I was using got broken into, but I now have to change my password on that website. And if you don't, then potentially you may not be eligible for the class. Now, this is the crazy thing because we see two things here. We see $15K in costs, $437K in cost, and $200,000 in cost. So even though we're talking about a 1.75 million, we can basically cut 650 odd K off the top of it, leaving a total amount of 1.15 million. Now, understand that people that were eligible for this class, there were 96,000 victims, okay? Nobody is getting rich from data breach class actions, okay, at all. So, because if you divide that number, it ain't a really big number at all. Now, I've got a little bit of time before I get to talk to my friends at Red Canary about what they're seeing on the technical side, but I got two more, well, maybe three things that we can cover off really quickly. So the first is this. China transformed its cyber capabilities back in 2015. Basically, when they were publicly embarrassed about them stealing all the intellectual property of the United States in breaches like Lockheed Martin and the continuing ripoff of Cisco products, et cetera, et cetera. But they have taken a page from how the Russians conduct cyber warfare and combine it with psychological warfare as well as things like information operations. This has led to the over several years the centralization of the PLA's cyber espionage and cyber attack forces. Now, what's really interesting is that we see the threat actors, the PLA, moving into rapid exploitation of organizations that haven't adopted EDR and MDR or that have devices that are vulnerable. These threat actors have been basically attacking organizations that are failing on their vulnerability for those IoT devices and for those hard-to-patch things like hypervisors that require you to take the entire network down and all of the servers in order to patch a hypervisor, because nobody YOLOs a hypervisor update with boxes running. If you're doing that, well, it's the equivalent of updating the firmware in a RAID card on a Friday before a long weekend. Very bad things are going to happen. So this is really interesting because this report came out from Mandiant about the PLA's cyber espionage capabilities and how they're attacking organizations for persistence on IoT devices, VPN technologies, and firewalls. Now, this was another thing that came out that we can learn so much about, okay? Now, I put in a couple of links here, but XE Group, something that a lot of folks that work in cyber threat may not have really thought about for a while. They're known as a Vietnam cybercrime group. We don't believe they have APT affiliated or a part of the Vietnamese government, but they have been around for a very long time, 8 years plus, and were known for their hacking, card, and skimming for profit, attacking IIS, specifically Telerik and ASP.NET. Now, the thing that's crazy here, and this is a speculation, are we seeing a formation of a Chinese threat actor group and possibly outsourcing capability for a Vietnamese criminal cyber group in order to gain access to U.S. government information, Internet Information Systems server running Telerik UI for ASP.NET AJAX, all right? So it's mind-blowing because if you think now that cybercrime groups are going to look up a Rolodex of, hey, do you know anyone that's good at getting at IIS, Telerik, UI, ASP.NET AJAX? And someone on their index, I know a guy that knows a guy that knows a guy. Maybe they can hook us up. So you have this one group known for attacks on hacking, skimming type of stuff, and all of a sudden they're being leveraged, or their capabilities are leveraged, or maybe their actual exploits are being leveraged to get another threat actor, which we think were the Chinese, into a U.S. government agency. So synergies is one of the trends that I see happening, where the capabilities that you need to get into an organization are readily available to the cybercriminal underworld. Now, just a few things that I want to leave you with, because what we're going to do is we're going to turn the stage over to our friends at Red Canary very shortly, is we need to look at implementing robust technology such as cloud firewalls. Now, the reason why I'm pro-cloud firewalls is not only did I have an amazing webinar a couple of weeks ago on cloud firewalls, but what I quickly understood is that if firewalls and on-premise firewalls become a liability like we've seen them in the past few years, it might be time to consider a major architecture change and look at the ability to have the power and scalability and bandwidth of the cloud at their disposal to deal with the type of attacks that we're seeing from those threat actors. I think it's fair to say I'm a big fan of MDR, especially the work that Red Canary does and a few others that I know of. The reality is being on call 24/7 and standing up a SOC and standing up the capabilities you need to defend your organization is a very expensive endeavor and a nearly impossibility for folks working in the mid-market. Now, fundamental to all of this is keeping your IT asset management and your configuration management databases up to date. If you're not doing that, then fancy devices, excellent services, if they don't know about what you have, they won't be able to protect it. So these are some of the fundamental things that I see organizations failing. It's the entire legacy application landscape is just something folks don't want to talk about. They don't want to talk about their exposures that they have. These are the way organizations are getting owned. Anyone with an on-premise Exchange server throughout the 2022 just knows that it was miserable with patch after patch after 0 day after patch, and their life was absolutely miserable. The other big thing is to look at and adopt a risk-based approach to vulnerability management. I see so much failure in the industry here where organizations are spending a tremendous amount of time on patching very low-risk things just because it's identified as a CVE 9.5. And as a result of a great webinar and my own personal work with Zscaler, as you Americans love to call it, we in Canada always say Zscaler, and these Zscaler people are really cool. But the point here is that if there are ways of isolating, of segmenting, of making sure that the vulnerable thing that you have cannot be accessed over the internet without some sort of mitigating control structure in place, then you can really dial down and focus your vulnerability management on going after the things that are risks to your organization or are far greater risks to your organization. And then my last cry is do not postpone the pen test or the compliance audit. Get it done. As painful as it might be, it is an excellent business case for cybersecurity improvement, perhaps even outsourcing some of that function. But you think of it as a roadmap for success, because if the pen testers can find it, it's a good chance the bad guys may have already found it and just haven't used it yet to your detriment. So I feel like with that, we can shut this portion of the presentation down, and we can open it up. I don't know if we're opening up for Q&A now, or if we're going to do that after the presentation. Oh, no, it is audience Q&A.
Yeah, let's go with our Q&A. Remember, guys, you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Let's grab the first question here. It's from Sean. He's wondering, what do you expect from North Korean hackers moving forward into 2023?
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing. So they're going to continue to antagonize enemies of China. There's no question about that. But what North Korea has really seemed to do an excellent job of, the state-sponsored threat actors, is going after Bitcoin exchanges, wallets, and any sort of thing to do with cash. Now, this doesn't come as a big surprise, John, because the country has been under financial sanctions forever. So even their occasional flirtation with ransomware and bespoke malware, this is all about the money. So in a way, they're almost like a cybercriminal threat actor, and they've dialed the stealing and espionage stuff and overt disruption campaigns down. And I think they're going to be ramping up the financial fraud or the financial targets now and in the near future.
Okay. Let's see. We just got a comment from Cynthia that says, these numbers and financial amounts are crazy. No kidding. So here's one from Casey. Will efforts to regulate social media impact nation-state disinformation operations? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, that is an amazing question. I think it'll have some impact, but I think one of the things we're really challenged with right now, and I think, and this is sort of 2023, it will be really interesting to see if all of the work that's going into AI and chat, like GPT chat, will be able to start swatting this down faster than humans can. I think there's going to be mistakes, right? And there always is in this kind of thing. But I think that we're going to get faster. I think the regulation that is calling out social media as the major source for disinformation. I mean, maybe, John, I don't think we'll be so successful that people are going to be printing flyers and distributing on the street corners. But I think this is recognized now as a major problem. I know the UK government is looking at pretty stringent requirements under the Online Harms Bill. So more to follow on that. It's a great question. I mean, I think somebody more learned than me on this could write an excellent thesis, or one of the think tanks should put out a report on it. I'd read that report.